When imagining a future conflict involving China, several likely scenarios spring to mind. An invasion of Taiwan, say, or a border escalation with India, or even a confrontation with the US. But with Beijing's increasing assertiveness, the number of potential flashpoints is growing. Nowhere is this truer than in the Indo-Pacific, where many nations have been forced to accommodate China out of fear. But there's one Indo-Pacific outlier that has instead chosen a different approach. An approach that swaps accommodation for confrontation, and that of course is the Philippines. Despite having previously leaned toward China under President Duterte, the Philippines has shifted course under President Marcos Jr., who took over the reins in 2022. Since then, Manila has bolstered security ties with the US, pursued legal action over the South China Sea, and actively challenged Chinese provocations. All of which has earned the nation a special place on Beijing's naughty list. While everyone loves an underdog, it's worth noting that this isn't some Hollywood rom-com. In the arena of international affairs, a happy ending is never guaranteed, and with China in no mood for compromise, these tensions could be leading to one unwelcome outcome, and that's war. Just before we continue today, you ever Googled yourself? Googled your name? Maybe plug in the name of the town that you live in, or you're from, or you lived in the past, and it'll be like, oh, my address, huh? My phone number? No, what's going on? Look, it could all be sitting there on random websites, and that's because of these fine people called data brokers. And by fine people, I mean they suck. Those sites, the data broker sites, they exist to sell your data to anyone who wants it. Scammers, marketers, worse. But Incogni, they find where your personal data is exposed, and they can get it taken down for you. They contact the data brokers and directories directly, legally, and confirm when your information is actually removed. Their process was independently verified by Deloitte, so you know it works. And with the new custom removals feature, you can go even further. Just send Incogni a link to any site showing your data, things like court record portals or people's search listings, and their privacy team will handle it. Unlimited requests handled by real specialists. So, take your personal data back with Incogni. Use the code WarFronts at incogni.com/warfronts to get 60% off an annual plan. They can't harm you if they can't find you. And now back to today's episode. Might is right. Geostrategic competition in the South China Sea. The China-Philippine confrontation boils down to one very important flashpoint, the South China Sea. Roughly 3.5 million square kilometers in size, the South China Sea contains over 250 islands, atolls, and reefs. But what really matters is its grand geostrategic importance. For China, establishing a dominant position would represent a crucial step forward toward being able to puncture the first island chain, a strategic noose encircling the country composed of wary nations. Its existence threatens China's maritime access, particularly in the event of war. Considering the country's export-led economic structure, from Beijing's perspective, the need to loosen the rope is nothing short of existential. From the Philippines' perspective, this body of water isn't even known as the South China Sea. Instead, Manila calls it the West Philippine Sea, although the name change doesn't mean it's any less important. President Marcos Jr. outlined his country's feelings at the May 2024 Shangri-La Dialogue when he proclaimed that, quote, "The life-giving waters of the West Philippine Sea flow in the blood of every Filipino. We cannot allow anyone to detach it from the totality of the maritime domain that renders our nation whole." Unfortunately for Manila, Beijing is doing just that. China lays claim to no less than 90% of the South China Sea through its 9-dash line, arguing that Chinese exporters were the first to venture into the waters. However, as research by the Council on Geostrategy points out, this demarcation, quote, has no legal or historical basis. It is the product of misunderstandings and mistranslations by officials and private individuals in China during the 1930s. Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines all contest China's claims. With territorial tensions simmering for decades, the dispute has been a slow-burning source of friction with occasional flare-ups. And there is little indication that these flames are going to die down anytime soon. Right now, Beijing's whole deal is using grey zone warfare to bully other claimants while avoiding open conflict. However, while China does not appear to want a war, a single misstep could easily set the entire region ablaze. Aside from those involving Taiwan, no other maritime disputes are more likely to be the trigger than those involving the Philippines. One of the biggest concerns is the Spratly Islands, claimed in whole or part by China, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. The archipelago is spread over a vast area in the central South China Sea. The naturally occurring land area is less than 5 square kilometers, and while that might not sound like much, and it isn't much, with the Spratlys sitting among some of the world's busiest shipping lanes, rich fishing grounds, and vast energy reserves, the islands are prime real estate. China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Taiwan each occupy features within the Spratlys. While China has 7 outposts, Vietnam has 21, the Philippines occupies 9, Malaysia possesses 5, and Taiwan maintains a single island. One recent dispute occurred in the Spratlys in April 2025 when a Chinese state-run newspaper published photos showing military personnel posing with a national flag on Sandy Cay. The reef, which at just over 200 square meters is barely big enough to build a sandcastle, was subsequently visited by the Philippines Coast Guard a few days later for another photo op. The episode was named by some journalists as the War of the Selfies. Another point of conflict in the Spratlys is found at Second Thomas Shoal, located 195 kilometers west of Palawan in the Philippines. In 1999, the Philippines deliberately ran aground a World War II-era ship called the BRP Sierra Madre onto the reef. The boat now acts as an outpost, with a small garrison of Philippines Marines stationed there ever since. Unsurprisingly, China was not very impressed by Manila's ingenuity. Most famously in 2014, China maintained a 3-week-long blockade of the Sierra Madre, forcing the Philippines to airdrop supplies to those stationed aboard. Although Manila's actions resulted in Beijing ending the blockade, recent years have seen China amassing increasing numbers to harass resupply missions. Tactics such as ramming, loud sirens, blinding lights, and water cannons are regularly employed to assail Philippine vessels brave enough to enter the area. As the situation escalates and the Sierra Madre continues to rust away, the outpost's longevity remains uncertain. And not just because the sea may yet reclaim it. Tensions spiked in August 2025 when a Chinese tugboat was spotted near the ship, fueling speculation that Beijing might be preparing to tow it away. Although the Philippines Navy was quick to brush off the concerns and downplay the threat, the risk cannot be ruled out. Stranger things have indeed happened at sea. Some 220 kilometers west of the Philippines' main island, Luzon, Scarborough Shoal marks another hotspot. Beijing seized the atoll from the Philippines in 2012 after a weeks-long standoff with the Philippines Navy, which eventually ended with the latter pulling back. Since then, China has maintained a constant and expanding patrol presence, enforcing a 22-kilometer exclusion zone through the same aggressive methods employed elsewhere. As a result, China's Coast Guard and fishing vessels now dominate the area, preventing Philippine ships from entering the lagoon. The buildup of multiple layers of Chinese ships around disputed areas in the South China Sea is known as the cabbage strategy, a reference to the characteristically leafy layers of the vegetable. As noted by The Atlantic, and we'll quote them here, a Chinese presence and de facto Chinese rights in disputed areas are built up gradually in a series of provocations that are individually small enough to make forceful resistance politically difficult, but that collectively establish precedents and, over time, norms. End quote. One particularly striking dimension of this strategy has been the dredging of sediment to create and expand artificial reefs, effectively transforming them into military bases and strategic ports. This has been employed in the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands to the northwest. In addition to demonstrating how China is mobilizing its superior forces to maximum effect, these projects enable Beijing to consolidate its territorial claims, expand power projection capabilities, and tighten control over fishing grounds and energy resources. As this process continues and the power imbalance grows, one wrong move could easily plunge the region into conflict.
And now a quick word from our sponsor, me, or more precisely, my website, fronts.co. Have you ever found yourself thinking, there's just not enough content on WarFronts. 6 videos a week is just not enough for me. I want the world to be crazier. I want more war, more death. Well, 1, what's wrong with you? And 2, great news. Extra WarFronts content is now at your fingertips over at fronts.co. Look at that. Yes, starting this very week, we'll be posting 2 exclusive videos every week to our new subscriber-only website, fronts.co. For just $5 a month, you'll gain access to brand new WarFronts content that won't be available on YouTube. Our first videos are already up, exploring topics as timely as whether Poland could win a war against Russia, and as timeless as how South Korea came to build the best tank on Earth. And to sweeten the deal, we're also asking our writers to contribute 2 in-depth written articles each week, exploring some unusual or less appreciated angle on geopolitics and warfare. So, not only will you get more of the videos you love, you'll also get a chance to read some of our writers' unfiltered takes on war news. So look, if you like this channel, you'll love fronts.co. Again, $5 a month. It helps support us here at Fronts, WarFronts, Political Fronts, and Fronts.co. And nothing is changing here. I have learned from the mistakes of past YouTubers. We are not doing a paywall on any existing content. The 6 videos a week will be here for you just as before. It's all just gravy, baby! Don't know why I went all Austin Powers there. But yeah, Fronts.co. Just go there. Good domain, right? It was expensive.
David versus Goliath. Now, given all that we just outlined, you've probably realized by now that the situation in the South China Sea is precarious. But what makes it especially worrying is the way that both Beijing and Manila are increasingly undertaking military actions to cement their claims. Every week, the Philippines sends reconnaissance flights near Scarborough Shoal to challenge China's exclusion zones. There have been incidents where Chinese helicopters have deliberately flown within meters of Philippine planes, putting lives on both sides at risk. If that isn't alarming enough, on the 11th of August 2025, dramatic footage was released showing a Chinese warship colliding with a Chinese Coast Guard vessel while chasing a Philippine patrol boat near Scarborough Shoal. Although the stricken Chinese vessel remained afloat, its entire bow was crumpled inward by the crash. At least 3 China Coast Guard personnel were on the bow at the time. While there has been no confirmation of any casualties, there is no guarantee that Beijing would be forthcoming with such information if there were. The situation's been a bit of a PR nightmare. On the subject of PR spins, it is worth noting that barely a drop of water enters the South China Sea these days without triggering a wave of gaslighting from Beijing. Following joint maritime exercises involving the US, Japan, and the Philippines in the latter's exclusive economic zone in September 2025, the Chinese military came out swinging with a statement ironically asserting that, quote, "We sternly warn the Philippine side to immediately stop provoking incidents and escalating tensions in the South China Sea, as well as bringing in external forces for backing such efforts that are destined to be futile." Close calls in the South China Sea raise serious concerns about what would happen if one of those incidents caused a death directly as a result of another country's actions. While there have been no fatalities so far, and here I'm not going to so much as knock on wood as desperately start drumming on it, I don't have my desk anymore. Not even these shelves are made out of wood, there's nothing! President Ferdinand Marcos has warned that any Filipino deaths resulting from China's actions would be considered a, quote, act of war. Although these words could be designed to deter China rather than constituting an actual threat, with any war between the pair destined to have significant global implications, it is worthwhile examining how such a conflict could unfold. After all, how could the Philippines, a country better known for its universal love of karaoke rather than its military prowess, possibly stand up against the overwhelming power of the People's Liberation Army? Well, to be honest, the brutal reality is that it wouldn't be able to. I mean, just look at the matchup on paper. While the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute put China's 2024 military budget at $314 billion, the Philippines stood at just $6.1 billion. With China fielding the world's largest military at roughly 2.04 million troops compared with the Philippines' 143,000, there is a similar disparity regarding personnel. The imbalance is also evident in their respective arsenals. China has 3 aircraft carriers, the Philippines none. China has 5,000 main battle tanks. The Philippines has 10. China has 1,025 military ships. The Philippines has 134. In other words, the story is less David and Goliath and more Goliath and the ant that he stepped over en route to challenge David. Now, we should be clear that it is extremely unlikely that any China-Philippines war would involve either side using their full might. It is also improbable that such a conflict would involve a full-scale ground war. The costs outweigh the benefits to Beijing, even if Xi Jinping believes he's guaranteed a victory. However, a limited campaign in which each side strikes the other's outposts could be on the cards. Although a highly risky game, policymakers in Beijing may assess that their overwhelming military power could enable them to quickly achieve their strategic objectives before the US intervenes. As for what that might look like, well again, it's difficult to envision the fighting spilling onto the Philippine mainlands as part of a Chinese campaign of broad territorial conquest. Doing so would be logistically complex, costly, and extremely dangerous given the presence of US forces. Operations, then, would likely be naval and air-focused, as well as highly localized, aiming to occupy or neutralize specific islands and outposts. With the technological sophistication of the PLA, Beijing would likely rely on precision airstrikes to do the heavy lifting before any troop landings. Manila, meanwhile, would probably rely on defensive fortifications, asymmetric tactics like hit-and-run strikes or sea denial operations, and swift diplomatic efforts to bring the US into the fight. And it's here that we get to the main card that Manila is holding. The one that might make China think twice about going all in on a conflict. Cue the Star-Spangled Banner and enter the United States of America. The US and the Philippines are joined at the hip by several strategic agreements. Chief among them is the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, which obligates both nations to support each other if either is attacked by an external party. While the terms work both ways, the strategic dependence flows very much in one direction, and it's not towards a future where Filipino troops come to save America from invasion by Mexico. Presently, the US has access to 9 Philippine bases on a rotational basis, 6 Air Force bases, 2 Army bases, and 1 naval base located in northern Luzon. Washington previously had access to 5 before President Marcos Jr. reached an agreement with the Biden administration in February 2023 to provide access to an additional 4. Other examples of Manila deepening security ties with the US include Washington announcing $500 million of military funding for the Philippines in July 2024 and a deal in November of the same year to allow classified information sharing between the pair. So, any attempt to imagine what a conflict between Beijing and Manila would look like inevitably comes down to one question: would Uncle Sam really intervene? And these days, the answer is, well, we're not quite so certain, are we? Even beneath the US security umbrella, Philippine politicians worry about whether the current Trump administration would fully honor the Mutual Defense Treaty. If Washington isn't prepared to intervene in the event of a conflict with China, they may as well be holding a sieve over their heads. It is well known that Trump has opted for a transactional foreign policy contingent on limited interventionism and prioritizing securing economic concessions over traditional alliances. With little optimism about the US honoring international obligations, it is only natural that Manila would grow concerned. Still, it's not all doom and gloom. While we don't know what will happen when push comes to shove, Washington's rhetoric appears to suggest a determination within at least parts of the Trump administration to support the Philippine cause. In January 2025, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio assured Manila of America's, quote, ironclad commitment to defending the Philippines in the face of growing Chinese aggression. US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth echoed a similar position in July 2025 while hosting Marcos Jr. at the Pentagon, asserting that, quote, our storied alliance has never been stronger or more essential than it is today. Together, we remain committed to the Mutual Defense Treaty, and this pact extends to armed attacks on our armed forces, aircraft or public vessels, including our Coast Guard, anywhere in the Pacific, including the South China Sea. End quote. By identifying the Indo-Pacific as its primary theater, the US has sent a signal strong enough to make China think twice. The fact that Beijing has refrained from using lethal force in the South China Sea could be partly attributed to this. However, we don't mean to sound cynical, but there is a chance that these assurances are just empty words. After all, if behind closed doors Washington has no intention of coming to Manila's aid, it would still be in its interest to posture and deter China with hollow threats to kick the can down the road. The Philippines, therefore, needs to prepare for all potential contingencies, including a situation in which Uncle Sam doesn't come to the rescue. And it's not only in the South China Sea where such conflict could kick off. The Philippines has been particularly vocal when discussing the prospect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, with Philippine Military Chief General Romeo Brawner recently stating that, quote, if something happens to Taiwan, inevitably we will be involved. He added that, quoting again, we should have that mentality that we are already at war. While this would, of course, be different from a conflict breaking out directly between China and the Philippines, the risk underscores the likely role the Philippines will play in any future conflict involving China in the Indo-Pacific. Approaching tipping point. So, big question, where's all this end? In all likelihood, we can expect to see a continuation and expansion of the grey zone methods employed by China to harass the Philippines. Don't be surprised if Beijing starts to bring some of the tactics employed elsewhere into the equation. One example would be severing undersea cables to cut off communications and internet access, as seen in the Taiwan Strait. Another would be tampering with the Philippines' elections, as China has been accused of doing in Taiwan, Canada, and the United States. Philippine authorities recently flagged the alleged meddling of China in the May 2025 midterm local and national elections. According to officials, China-backed operations are actively spreading disinformation and divisive political discourse. Deputy Speaker of the Philippine House of Representatives, Paolo Ortega, has highlighted that, quote, "This is foreign interference designed to infiltrate our politics, confuse our people, and weaken our country from the inside." By exploiting societal divisions, China could push to destabilize the Philippine government. The prospect appears more plausible in light of the recent protests in Manila on the 21st of September 2025, when peaceful protests against corruption in flood control projects turned ugly, with mass arrests, police vehicles set ablaze, and dozens of police officers injured by rock-hurling demonstrators. With tensions already high, the conditions are ripe for Beijing to exploit. But things can get a whole lot worse than grey zone warfare. When it comes to the South China Sea, there is a foreboding sense that on the current trajectory, it's only a matter of time before an incident occurs that sparks something bigger. Whether the two sides can keep a lid on it is anybody's guess. Given the grave risks associated with a China-Philippine war developing into a Sino-American conflict, you would hope that sufficient diplomatic impetus exists to enable a de-escalation if things risk getting really out of hand. The fact that such a scenario would also be economic suicide for all sides should add further incentive to resolve things at the negotiating table. In fact, many more countries could be drawn in, with Australia, Japan, the UK, and other Western allies providing diplomatic support, intelligence sharing, or logistical assistance to the Philippines. On the other side, Russia and potentially North Korea could step in to back China. While Moscow's quagmire in Ukraine would likely reduce its role to a supportive one, Pyongyang's willingness to provide boots on the ground to repel Ukrainian soldiers from Kursk suggests that it could play a more direct part. If there's one thing we've learned from 2025, it's that conflicts can be fought between countries despite the potentially catastrophic ramifications. Remember the limited wars between India and Pakistan in May, Thailand and Cambodia in July, as well as the 12-day war between Israel, the US, and Iran? But here's the thing, Beijing doesn't exactly need to risk it. In a one-party state like China, strategic policy directions can be sustained for much longer periods. This is because leadership changes happen less often, and when they do, the successor comes from within the same party, ensuring a degree of continuity. At 72 years old, Xi Jinping could remain the leader of the Chinese Communist Party for years to come. Even if he were struck down by lightning tomorrow, his replacement would likely hold similar views regarding China's role and strategies in the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, in democracies such as the Philippines, more frequent leadership changes often result in the country changing direction and heading toward a new vision. We've seen this in the contrasting stances on China taken by President Marcos Jr. and his predecessor, Duterte. Essentially, while Beijing can play the long game, the Philippines' current push to assert its rights in the South China Sea risks being undermined by a future administration that takes a softer line on China. Furthermore, even if the Philippines maintains its willpower to go toe-to-toe with China in the South China Sea, as Beijing expands its presence and efforts in the region, determination might prove to not be enough. With China confident that its superior economic and military power will eventually bend its neighbor to its will, it would be useful for the Philippines to turn to the other claimants in the South China Sea to counter China. Although maritime security deals have been signed with Vietnam, strengthening ties further and seeking multinational cooperation with other claimants could be beneficial if done correctly. This could complement the country's current alliances with extra regional powers such as the US, Japan, and Australia. Intelligence sharing, joint exercises, coordinated patrols, and reaching compromises over competing claims are just some of the examples of steps that could be taken. As the saying goes, united we stand, divided we fall. And should a war kick off that sees Manila stand alone against Beijing, then the sad reality is that the fall could be faster and more brutal than anyone could predict. Thank you for watching.